go through some of my experiences of the astral planes in different veins, including an experience I've not talked about before, which is really quite personal, and haven't even told the people that are involved. It was something I was going to save for my book, but I'd like to share it tonight at some point. One of the things that sometimes I get people that come to my workshops because they have loved ones that have been recently deceased, and they wanted to be able to make contact. And I can certainly understand why, because we've all probably had loved ones that have passed when we haven't been there to say goodbye. I mean, is that a situation for quite a few of us? For me, the first in this way was with my biological father, and I remember the morning so clearly, just sort of etched in my mind, because my father was a very hard-working man, and he was always out of the house before we woke up. He was a construction worker, and he'd be out, usually I'd say 7 a.m., and we'd usually wake up around 7:30 to get ready for school. And on this day, I remember walking by his bedroom and seeing him lying down on the bed with his feet sort of hanging off the bed onto the floor. And I heard his breathing, which just, didn't sound good. I was 10 years old at the time. And I remember going to school, and I knew something was wrong, because my father was a very strong man. I knew he wouldn't be breathing like that, certainly not in bed still on a weekday. And I went to school, and I buried my head in my arms the whole day, and I cried the whole day, because I knew something was really wrong. And by the time I got back home, they'd already taken him to hospital, and he was in the hospital for the next 2 weeks. During that time, I've got 3 brothers, and it was only my older brother who was allowed to go in, who I think was 14 years old at the time. So they deemed, because he was a bit older, he might sort of better deal with the situation. So 2 weeks in, my father died while in the hospital. So the younger 3, me and my other 2 younger brothers, we didn't get to say goodbye. And I don't think my older brother expected he was going to die either, so technically he didn't get to say goodbye either. So for months after his funeral, I cried every day for months. And I mean, it was really quite devastating for me, and well, as it would be. And I remember it finally came one day when my mother came to me, and I think she was hurting really bad, but she wasn't showing it. I think she was trying to be really strong for us children. And she said to me, and I think, this is probably because of the pain she was in, and it was just that reflection back where I was crying every day, and it was just that reminder that she couldn't cry herself because she was trying to be so strong. Or maybe she cried in private, but she said, "Todd, at some point you gotta stop crying." And I don't think she really meant that I can't grieve, but I think it was just that outward expression which she felt she couldn't do in front of us. And that night, went to sleep, and my bedroom was always blacker than black because I had blinds and I had sort of curtains, and you couldn't see your hand in front of your face once I had the lights off. I remember waking up in the early hours of the morning, and I'd had the OBE stuff up to that time. Again, I didn't know that's what it was, but I knew it was quite interesting stuff. And when I woke up in the morning, I was in paralysis, and this is one of my first experiences with paralysis as a child. And I remember sensing someone standing at the end of the bed, and I could tell it was my father. And suddenly I had his voice in my head, and he was telling me how happy he was, and that he was in a place where is beautiful, and he's met some new friends. And because of the experiences I had at the time, I trusted that really was him. And from that day onwards, I had this weight just lifted off my shoulders as a 10-year-old boy. And it was, I think the grief was compounded even more because of the way that I was told my father died. I remember my mother went to the hospital that night, on that last night, and none of us knew it was going to be the last night. And my 3 brothers and I were being sort of babysat by one of our neighbors. And at some point the phone rang, and he looked quite serious when he got off the line with his wife, and let him sort of communicated. And obviously my mother told them the news and asked if they could tell us before she got home, because she just, I guess, wasn't up to it. And they then started playing with us in a very awkward way, and it just felt disjointed. And my mother drove up in the car, and they still hadn't told us, and they quickly took us into the bedroom, and I sat down on a beanbag, and they said they had something to tell us, and it was just so ridiculously botched the way they did it. And that whole night, I don't remember anybody hugging me and telling me, things would be okay or anything. And that's the kind of thing that can create, this emotional traumas. And I still have emotional work in that area. I find, that I've been doing for quite a while, and it's quite a strong one that is slowly moving. So I think this is probably why I grieve so much, because of the trauma behind it. But I then experienced years later when my mother remarried, and my stepfather and I, we didn't really get on very well. And I think this was probably because I missed my father so much, and I was just being typically rebellious. And so it was for about a period of 10 years that he was in my life. And I remember moving to the UK when I was 23. And I was here for a few months. And then my stepfather became really ill and died also in hospital. And I didn't get a chance to say goodbye. And again, I was really quite hurt by that, because I was stubborn up until that time when he died. And I didn't want to be the one to first say sorry for all the misery that was caused between us over the years. And it probably should have come from me first, because I really was quite, a rebellious little shit towards him. And so years and years later, as an adult, I think it was my first year into OBEs when I was an adult, so age 36, where I was on my sofa, I had this massive energy tunnel open up beyond my eye mask, and the vibrations, and I was lifting away from my body. I went through this beautiful tunnel of light. It was vibrant purple, or violets, and white, and some black, and it was so beautiful. And I remember going through this tunnel and feeling that motion and trusting that it was taking me somewhere of use. And I suddenly remember standing in this field, this beautiful lush field, with my stepfather standing there. And he moved towards me, and he had this energy about him. By that time, for me, again, it was, more than 20 years by this time had passed. And for someone that lives on the astral, their sort of time frame is different from ours. And I felt, when he moved towards me, the energy, the power that he had was so different from the man that I knew all those years ago. And the energy radiating from his energy, body, heart, and his astral sort of body was so powerful. As he moved towards me, I could just feel it interacting with my astral energy, body, heart, and just caused this eruption. And I had suddenly all these vivid images running through my mind of memories of all the fights, all the pain that had been caused in our relationship. And as he then embraced me, I could feel that stuff being sort of incinerated by love. It was like a powerful exercise in forgiveness. And I had the feeling that the karma between the two of us was, resolved in that moment. It was such a powerful experience. I remember when he pulled away, and he gave me this, sort of knowing look, and then he sort of just moved away. And I came back to my body, and I just let the rest of it out. I just gushed and cried, for quite some time. And it felt so good to get that closure. I've seen him several times in my journeys, but that was such a powerful moment. And it's, again, the people who come to, these events, who want to make those connections. We can make these connections through dreams, lucid dreams. We can make them through, our unconscious dreams, just by putting the intent out there, and then having the vividness of the dream to remember in the morning. Obviously, through out-of-body experiences, astral projection experiences. Some people will go to mediums to communicate with their loved ones. And to me, all these ways of communication are very valid. It's just a matter of, trusting that you can make that connection. In your dreams, every one of us, especially when we the astral body goes deeper in, drifts even deeper, does, an astral drift, and we go into dream mode. Any of the humans in those territories, or other beings who are wandering by, can almost too easily see the content that's going on within you, there's thought forms within your energy field, and they can literally peer into your energy field and see these dreams that we're immersed in at the moment. And they can penetrate the dream and interact with us. And this is what we experience sometimes. Has anyone had a loved one who has passed, and then you found them in your dreams, days and weeks afterwards, and it just felt so real? This is a very powerful communication tool. There was a time when, maybe about 6 or so years ago now, again, I was in my lounge and I came out of my body, and I was deposited on this city environment where very quickly I bumped into a woman who had not been deceased for very long on this level. I think it was about a week's period of time. And we communicated, and she was still using verbal sort of communication where, she was, I think, just beginning to learn nonverbal communication, telepathic skills. And as she was communicating with me, I was delving deeper into her life just to get a better story than, the linear sort of message that she was passing to me. And within a short period of time, she then sort of just, after we were communicating, she just sort of blinked out, teleported away. And I'd come across this phenomena before. I've experienced, teleportation myself while being out of body. But sometimes when somebody's energy, when somebody else is thinking about them, it can tug on their energy. And when it's a lot of people thinking about you, it can literally take your whole focus, and suddenly, you can be swept away in the energy of it. So, knowing the curiosity of this phenomena, I sort of thought about her, the woman I was just communicating with, really connected with her essence, with the intent that I wanted to follow. And suddenly I felt a rush of energy, and I was back near the physical plane and honed in a little bit more, and I found her again in a church. The chapel was about this size, actually, of this space. And it was full of all her friends and family, and it was her funeral. And this was such an amazing experience for me to witness. I learned so much from that one experience. And so if, imagine you're her friends, there's a closed casket up here. And if you can imagine yourself in her shoes, you now know that you're alive, you survived death. You're not just alive, but you're thriving on another level of reality. You've probably been reintroduced to one of your spiritual homes, a place that you're very familiar with, that you lived before you came here. It only makes sense that we would navigate back towards places that we have a vibrational affinity with. So put yourself in her shoes. So she's now walking around with this full knowledge that she survived death. She has friends and loved ones that have gone before her. She's probably already reunited with lovers from past lives or parallel lives, fathers and mothers, other people that can come and go just to wish you well in between your interlife state before possibly reincarnating again. Because it's a wonderful way to make that connection beyond dream states. So imagine her walking around now. Imagine yourself walking around now with that knowing and being able to sort of, as she did, put her hand on people's shoulders. Obviously, she couldn't quite physically touch them. But suddenly, can you imagine maybe your hair standing on end? Or suddenly get a feeling that your loved one is close by, but you're just not entirely, you can't be sure. She pretty much went from everyone in the room, from friend to friend, family to family member. And I could hear her whispering in their ears, her favorite interactions with them, her favorite memories with them. And the energy was, very tangible. You could feel the energy lifting in the space. By the time she was finished, she was like an energy magician. The emotional energy had just changed. Everybody was now sort of, instead of, their faces down, they were up, their shoulders were more back. They were, looking at each other in a way where they felt more comfortable. And it was just such a powerful experience for everyone. And I felt so privileged to be able to experience something like that. And I remember when she finished, she walked back over to me, and we both knew it was time to go, and we left. And not soon after that, I asked my guides while I was out on another occasion about people and their funerals. And my guides told me that it is the same for most people, that when they die, if they're not sort of stuck in one of these sort of intermediate states where they're creating their own self-created hell, if you like. Because there's no God that's imprisoning people in sort of these demonic places. That's not reality. This is all, based on vibrational matches. And, people can literally get stuck in their own sort of bubbles that are no different from your nocturnal dreams. And that's the extent of most of this. And yes, there are consensus realities which, are very moody environments, and environments which, do seem to sort of suggest, people are beating themselves up in a sense, torturing themselves. Their thought forms are doing a good job for them too. And it's not nice to come across environments of that nature. But again, there's always help from all levels of reality. And it's just a matter of saying here, when we start to open our energy again to the help that is there, it very quickly, we're able to experience it. So when I then looked back after that experience with my father's funeral, and I remember standing there, it was an open casket funeral, and I remember stroking his face and wondering if he was there at his funeral. I'm pretty certain now, because of the experience I had with this woman, that he was. And it gave me this great sense that when I was 10 years old, not only did I get to meet him a couple months after he died in my bedroom, but also at his funeral, he was probably there, and he probably put his hand on my shoulder, reminded me that he loved me, told me that, he's in a good place. But I wasn't able to hear because I was grieving, like everyone else, and I wasn't in that good space to be able to have my clairvoyance tuned in or my clairaudience tuned in enough to be able to experience him, but he would have most likely been there. So, and there's a story that Jürgen didn't share, but if you've read his book, which I find really interesting, it's not just the death and finding our loved ones on the other side, but finding our loved ones back on this side before we die. Jürgen had a great example of that when he used to go out and visit his mother after she died. And at one point he said to her, "Have you seen my father? I don't ever see him." And she said, "I don't really see him anymore. I saw him for a while, but he's sort of not been around." And I don't think she was aware of what Jürgen was about to experience. And Jürgen then called, for some assistance. And a helper came and helped him navigate, I think, back near the physical plane. And they honed in on Russia. And there was this village in Russia, and in particular this house that they sort of zeroed in on. And there were two young boys playing in the front garden. I think one was 9, one was 12 years old. The 12-year-old was Jürgen's father. And this is in our timeline right now. So Jürgen's now in his 60s, and his father from his lifetime, this lifetime is now a 12-year-old, well, this was a few years ago, so a teenager in Jürgen's own lifetime. And the 10-year-old boy, the brother, is Jürgen's grandfather. And the mother of the two boys was his grandmother. And Jürgen gained all this information by, when you encounter, and you're in that real time zone, so you're in the near Earth frequency when you have an out-of-body experience, you can actually communicate with an aspect of that person, an aspect of their higher consciousness. And you can get a full-on conversation as if you're speaking to the person. And Jürgen said when he approached the two boys, the 12-year-old actually spoke up, not physically, but his inner self spoke up and said, Jürgen, is that you? And that was the father, but the higher aspect of the father, from a previous life, because he was no longer playing that role. So this stuff is really quite fascinating. Another friend from one of the 2-day tower events that I used to run, I call him Big Sam. He's a really big guy, and his name's Sam, so Big Sam, 2 and 2. And he came to my tower experience specifically to have an experience where he can go out of body and meet his recently deceased father. So he came to the tower, was there for 2 days. He didn't have an experience at the tower, but I said to Sam, look, Sam, I promise you, if you go home and you're consistent with this, and you have a high level of sort of practice, high quality practice, it will happen, and it will happen soon. And I remember him finally ringing me on the phone a couple weeks later and said, Todd, I got out of my body. And as luck would have it, the very first experience, I met my father. But there was a problem. And I said, okay, Sam, what was the problem? He said, well, I found him in this place where, he was with some other people, and he seemed happy enough. But when I went up to him and I literally was, Dad, and I hugged him, he pushed me away. And he said, whoa, slow down. And he knew who I was, but he'd already he was, quite changed. He was he insisted, he said, I used to be your father. I'm not your father anymore. But he knew, he knew who Sam was. But he was already transitioning to another personality, in that in-between life state. What I find really interesting is even the people that you sometimes meet, weeks or months after their physical death, physical earth in their lifetime here, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years, can start to fade like a dream. Think about, when you're practicing, your visualization techniques, and they're very sort of, the images is low quality perhaps, or you have an out-of-body experience the next day, and it just seems such a faded experience where you have doubts about it. Who's so far maybe had a lucid dream or a very vivid dream, out-of-body experience, and now the memory of it is so faded that you doubt maybe, did it actually happen? I mean, imagine having 70 or 80 years on this level of reality, and maybe a couple of months or years or more in the astral, years in particular, our time, and for your time on earth suddenly fading, and without someone to remind you, it just seems like a dream. And this is for what it's like for a lot of people in the astral. They forget. And you even get a degree of individuals, obviously, who are coming in from the other direction, who have never even been here yet. They don't even know this exists. They don't know the physical universe in the way we sense or categorize the physical universe doesn't exist. They're still perhaps getting their feet wet in the astral planes with their soul parked on this higher domain, and sort of the scout ships are being sent in, us in our infancy consciousness as these new human consciousness. This is non-human in nature, that deeper part of who we are. It's non-human. It's only this portion that's taken the human journey and has all these hundreds, if not thousands, of lifetime experiences between these different levels. So, when you do encounter sometimes recently deceased loved ones, maybe not recently deceased, 20, 30 years deceased, 10 years, decade deceased. Sometimes, you can make a connection and they can remember you and the veil can be lifted and you can have, a goodbye with them. But sometimes they've moved on. I mean, even Jürgen shared an experience, again, I think it's in one of his books, where when he first found his mother, she was in a very poor quality state of consciousness after death. But after a few times of coming and going to see her, he found her in a much more peaceful environment. And he said he'd interact with her for a few times, a few out-of-body experiences, and on one occasion he came back, and he said, Todd, she'd reverted down to about, maybe 19 years old in age, and she had big boobs. And that time she actually, on that experience, said to him, Jürgen, I'm not your mother anymore. And it was pretty obvious he wasn't his mother anymore. But this is what happens. We start to prepare, or we have other lifetimes, other parallel lives and memories that start to change our appearance, or when people realize they can change their appearance, then they do. I've actually been in environments where people are very plastically like Barbie doll and Ken dolls because they're competing with each other. In that particular environment, there's a lot of vanity. And people are just like getting plastic surgery done on the fly with themselves, and they're like, it's quite interesting and bizarre. The past lifetime stuff, parallel lifetime stuff, I find very interesting because it's part of our shadow work. They're connected to us, these other versions of you, these parallel life versions of you. You might find as you have out-of-body experiences, you'll meet parts of yourself in other sort of planes of reality, parallel Earth realities. I think the experience I'm about to share happened, I think, maybe 2 years or 3 years now into my experiences as an adult. I had the vibrations that came out of my body, and again, one of these energy tunnels, and I was on a train. And something felt really different about this experience. I was actually in somebody else's body. And I finally stood up and looked in a mirror on this train. It was a very opulent train, very luxurious. And I was this quite rotund fellow who was profusely sweating, and I could feel his body weight. I could feel, the sweat, the perspiration, and his thick emotions, which were just yucky. They were so turbulent. it was feelings of shame, deep, deep shame. And I suddenly thought, I want to get out of here. And I was out, and I was sort of on the other side of the train looking at him. And he was sort of dressed, very, very, quite sophisticated. And then somebody knocked on the door to this compartment and came in, and it was a man dressed in a military uniform, high-ranking uniform. And he said to this rotund fellow, he said, they'll be at the next station. And suddenly I was back in this man's body, and I was just getting these cold shivers, and I could feel his thoughts. And he started looking at the table next to him. He actually thought he could hide under the table because of the people they were going to meet. And he had such shame, he thought, maybe I can hide. And it's like, good luck getting under there in the first place. But I came back out of him again, and I was watching. His whole energy was, once again, it was deep-rooted shame. And the individuals that he was meeting was with other politicians and heads of state from around the region where he was from. And I got a name of this individual. I got details about the train itself, the details of the time period. I had the entire conversation that was exchanged between some of his, one of his military personnel that was with him, and information on the people that he was meeting. It was, to that date, it was some of the most detailed information I was able to actually retrieve and bring back with me. To the point when I got on Google and I did a Wikipedia search, I came up with him. And his as soon as I went into his Wikipedia page, there was this black and white image of him, and it was exactly the man that I had just witnessed. And the perception was that this was a parallel version of me, not as Todd, but as another counterpart of my soul family. And I just sort of remember sitting at my desk and thinking, really? Some people were like, I was Cleopatra in a past lifetime. I was this guy named Farouk. Does anyone know Farouk? Farouk. Farouk, yes. It's very good, Farouk. Yes. Farouk was called the Blue-Eyed King. He was his mother was the queen of Egypt back in the 1930s. His father was Albanian. Yes. His father was Albanian royalty and married the Egyptian queen, and Farouk was the byproduct of that union. And Farouk was his people did not like him very much at all. Where there was great poverty in the country at the time, back in the 1940s, when he took over, from his mother as king, he would go on these lavish shopping sprees to Europe, Paris, and spend all this money. He was very corrupt. He had many mistresses, and when he was in the 40s, and during World War II, I think it was right after World War II. When the Israeli state was formed. I think it was 1948, this conflict that took place. And this is what I was experiencing, that out-of-body experience. It was the aftermath. The Arab states had agreed with Egypt that Egypt would stand its army for Palestine against Israel. And in those last few days, Farouk pulled his army out. And this is when Israel went in and swept through and took something like 78% of Palestinian land at the time. Farouk literally was the cause of that. And that was the shame that he was feeling. Because he was, soon after that, he was exiled. And he was exiled to Italy. And he lived out his final days. His last experience actually on this level of reality was in a restaurant after something like a 10-course meal. And he literally died at the table. This big, rotund fellow. I was quite devastated. I was like, why? Couldn't I be Iron Man or something, But we all have our skeletons, I can assure you, in our sort of multidimensional family closet. Over the course of many years, with really pressing ahead with a high quality exploration practice, you will have past life experiences, parallel life experiences brought forward to you. A lot of the people that I've trained, who every now and again they drop me email messages and say, "Hey, this happened last night." And it was like a couple pages long, and I've always wanted to collate all of that with their permission and put together a book just on some of these incredible experiences. I've got another friend. He's a Qigong, a really amazing Qigong instructor, and I remember he went to one of the 9-day Ireland events. I think it was the very first one, in fact. And it's when I started teaching the idea that when I enter a room as a reality test, to test, put a finger through it, to make sure it's physical reality instead of non-physical reality. And so that was a big part of that first 9 days, is the reality test. And people were religious about it. When I walked into a room, they would, continue to do it. And he came to me one day after having one of his first OBEs at the event. He said, I tested reality in a dream experience, and I just want to see if you remember, or if this purely was just a dream. He said, I became lucid, and you started to approach me. And he said, I came up with my very own reality test. And remember, he's a Qigong sort of, and he's also a Kung Fu practitioner. He said, I thought I'd just sort of, stand, all serenely and kind of open my energy. And when you got close enough, I was just going to strike. And I was like, that's kind of violent, especially even if it wasn't me, it's still, a dream. Everything in it is a part of your own consciousness, so you're just kidding yourself. You're like, boo-hoo. So anyhow, he said, so when you got close to them, I struck you, and you swarmed into 1,000 fragments of, you were like 1,000 Todds spinning in this vortex of energy, and I was like, he was like, fuck, I need to get out of here. And he returned to his body. And that same 9 days, a couple days later, he came back to me and goes, Todd, I had another experience. And I was like, okay, please tell. And he said, yes, I was standing there, and there was this couple individuals, and then I noticed Jesus. And I was like, oh, please tell me he's not going to fist Jesus. He says, yes, Jesus started to approach, and I thought, I've got to test reality. I don't know if this is real. And he said Jesus came within sort of strike range, and he went for it. He just went whoosh, and he said Jesus did this. Jesus, it was like the Matrix went. The fist was withdrawn. He said Jesus did this. Hug. Come back and so on. I was like, no way, Jesus. And he said this went on for a couple of minutes, and I never once laid a punch on him. One thing I really adore as well is making friends on the astral that you can revisit. There's a family that I've met just twice, but the mother in particular, we had a very strong bond the very first time we met, and they live on the high astral planes in communities which are very harmonious, in their nature. And I remember the first conversation I had with her, and she seemed a little bit distracted, but she was actually tuning into my energy, into my human physical life here. And she said, do you sometimes after your breakfast, do you get pains? And I was like, yeah. And she said, it's animal juice. Animal juice? You put like a white animal juice on your... And I was like, cow's milk. And she's like, and I had this idea of a cow, and she's like, yes, cow. And I was like, she's like, I think you should stop with the cow juice. And I was like, okay. And I came back to my body, and for the next couple of weeks, I got lactose-free milk, and I never had another issue with milk. I mean, since now I drink nut milks, but she was bang on the money. She was spot on. Another experience, I was out on the Astral discoing once, and I didn't intend to go out of body and go partying, but I went out, and there was some clubs on this one particular strip of this city, and I went in, and I was having fun, I was meeting people, and I came back out, and I was just about to return to my body when I saw this sort of shop lit up with hair emporium. I was like, I felt really drawn. When I'm out of body, I have even bigger hair. I mean, it's really quite big. What's the Hotel Transylvania? The first one with the red head with all the big hair. And I was like, I felt drawn there, and I went in. And the owner of the Emporium, he came straight out. He was like, looked at my hair, and he was like, oh, and he sat me down, and he started literally massaging my scalp. But it was no normal scalp massage. He was literally really tuning in to my physical life, and he was like, "Does your scalp does it itch?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's been itching a lot over the last week, actually." He said, "There's an oil on your level that will help," and he put this word in my head, and I was like, "Thank you. I'll look for that." And he said, "Yes, some of your shops will have this." And I came back to my body, and that day I went down to the health food shop, and I asked, "Do you have something called jojoba?" And they gave me the oil, and this is apparently the closest thing to sebum, our naturally produced scalp oil, which won't clog the pores of the scalp, and you can use it to massage the scalp. I started using the oil, and within a few days, all of the inflamed scalp was starting to come back to a natural state. And so these kind of things, like the rayon as well, which recently. So there's information that can be used in your everyday life to make your life easier. You ask any, it's a shame Jurgen isn't here now, or Jason? No, he's off somewhere. I was hoping we'd actually have a panel discussion at one point. Wish we would have had the time for that. Another thing that I find really fascinating, which you probably would have experienced as a child, I think everybody pretty much does, but whether you remember it or not, is the astral classes that take place for sleepers, as Robert Monroe would call them. They're actually, some people refer to them as sleeper classes, and these are astral classrooms for when we go to sleep at night. And not every night, but on occasion we'll show up to these classes, and we'll actually be taught stuff that can be very useful for us in physical reality. And I remember when I left home at age 17, and my mother gave me the journals that she kept for me all those years between age 6 and 12. And as I was sort of traveling across America and I was reading through the journals, some of the stuff really made me laugh. I remember one when I was around age 10. And it was around a time when, after our father died, and we moved house, and therefore moved school as well. And for the first sort of year, I was bullied quite a bit. And the next year, same school, going up one class. And I remember the first day of school, I was thinking, okay, this is going to be better than last year. I'm going to make more friends, and this is going to be a better year. And I went to school not feeling quite so well. And that very first morning, the teacher said to people, okay, get up, go over and meet your classmates. And they had it to arrange where there's like 20 desks and chairs on this side, 20 on this side, facing each other. And I remember clocking this girl in the back, this blonde girl named Kathy. And I felt this real connection with her, just felt very strong. I hadn't met her before, but I was still of that, I'm going to make a good impression this year. And then the teacher said, okay, everybody stand up and go meet. And suddenly I felt so sick. And the blonde was walking right over to me. Kathy was walking right over to me. And I just went, all over the desk, all over Kathy. And I thought, what a good first impression. Nobody's going to forget that. There's no way I'm going to get picked on now. And sure enough, I got bullied again. But Kathy and I became, really quite good friends. And it was that year where there were other sports that I quite liked, but I was always quite awkward at American football for some reason. And it was in that year where whenever we'd have playtime from that class and we'd go out and, we'd have two captains, so they'd choose two captains, and the captains in America, and I'm sure here too, gets one choice, and they'll say, "Oh, I'll take Danny," or "I'll take Christy," and it was usually, unfortunately, because of sexism. It was the girls were always last. I always got picked after the girls. I was so bad at football. I got picked last, dead last, and I felt such shame. I remember on several occasions when it was time for the sleeper classes, and I would come out of my body, and I was met by someone that I would now know as a guide, and I was brought to one of these classes. I was asked, "Can you actually help me with football?" And I remember for about a couple of weeks getting out of body in these situations, and I was actually, brought to an environment where I was trained in playing football. And you wouldn't think, okay, well, that's not really an important skill to have, at that age, but it was for me because this was a way to bond with my classmates. And over the period of months after being shown this in these experiences, I started getting so good that I was one of the first few picked. And this was because I was learning while everybody else was sleeping. And it's the same with lucid dreamers. You'll hear lucid dreamers. Sky and I have a good friend, Lance will know her as well. Her name is Julie. She can lucid dream on demand. She's so good, she can lucid dream on demand. She can have 5, 6, 10 lucid dreams in a night. Fantastic dreamer, and she's pretty good at out-of-body stuff now too. And Julie is a dancer, and there was one particular move that she couldn't quite nail in physical reality that she finally nailed while in a lucid dream after some practice. And the first time after nailing it in the dream, she nailed it in physical reality as well. So for a lot of people, especially children at that age, we're being taught stuff in our sleep, in classes with other children. Monroe talks about it in some of his journal stuff in his books. You'll get other out-of-body explorers who will talk of very similar stuff. So what I'm hoping is maybe just the pure mention of some of this stuff might jog some of your memories. This is happening. It's happened with you already. So that I thought, that was a very interesting experience. And one of the things that really struck me a few years ago, when I had all this childhood OBE stuff, and in the classrooms, and being taught by, these other humans, I had an experience a few years ago where I came out of my body. I was living in Wembley at the time in London, and everything was really real. I knew I was in the close vibration of the earth, the physical earth, so the real time zone, and I thought, I want to go to London today, and I went to wander around London to see if I can see some of the thought forms from, the time of William Wallace and all this stuff, see if I can see heads on spears and stuff like that, if I sort of peer vibrationally just here and there. And you can. If you walk around London with your clairvoyance tuned in, you'll see all kinds of stuff, which is from other time periods. And it's a fascinating experience in itself. So as I was sort of now in the air and starting to sort of hover and make my way to London, I felt this strong tug of energy that was sort of upwards motion. And suddenly I shot up in the air like Superman. I was like, okay, this feels right. I'm going to follow this. And suddenly I was over Africa, quite a ways up, looking down at the earth. And it was such a beautiful experience to witness, the great Atlantic Ocean and Africa and, Spain, Portugal, from that sort of perspective. And suddenly I got this other sensation, as if cords were being run through me all of a sudden. Like connections were being made, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I was suddenly getting this download about teleportation. I was like, yeah, that is. And suddenly there are these sort of points of light that were coming up from below me. And these points of light suddenly turned into children. There were children who were having out-of-body experiences from all around the world that morning. And there was about 6 of them from different places. And I was instructed with the download to actually teach them how to move from one point of the planet to the next, because they're going to fly in their dreams. How many people flew when you were young and you had flying dreams? And you always flew from place to place. Did you ever teleport? I did. And I was actually being instructed with this download how to teach these children to go from one point around the planet to the next, not by flying like they had learned, in some of the sleeper classes, or from themselves through their past life experiences. And I remember we teleported a few places. I didn't lose anybody. Everything was good. And then we were just sort of together as a little team, and one of the boys said, "Can we go into outer space?" And I was like, "Yes, we can!" And my energy just was like a rocket, and I exploded out above the earth, and went so fast, and I sort of went straight through to another dimension of reality. And I was like, "Oh, fuck. I left my 6 charges, behind." I was like, I just see the morning papers and the Astral newspapers, teacher, OBE instructor leaves his 6 children in the upper atmosphere of Earth. And it's like, it was funny. And when I finally realized I was in this other dimension of reality, it was in this big warehouse. It was a really big warehouse, probably the volume of maybe 10 of this room. And in the middle of it, it was quite dimly lit. What was lighting the room was actually a huge model of the moon that almost took up the entire warehouse space of our physical Earth moon. And it was sort of very slowly rotating, not very fast, just enough. And I was like, wow, that looks familiar. And this man starts walking towards me, because I'd have several attempts by that point to get to the moon, and all like Jason's, all sort of miserably failed attempts. And this man walked up to me and he said, "Yes, this is a real-time model of the moon, of your Earth moon. And this is as close as we want you to get." I was like, "Really?" So Jason has his pictures of a moon in a room. I had mine in a warehouse. Some of the other places that are popular to visit once you start consistently getting out of the body, and you might be drawn to, are some of the healing levels of the astral. Has anyone ever sort of read anything on some of the healing centers on the astral planes? A few of you? There was an experience I had. So my out-of-body journeys as a child stopped at age 12. Came to a halt. Maybe it was the pineal gland sort of getting calcified. Maybe it was puberty. Whatever it was, something started closing that down. And I was 14 years old, so this was a couple years past that time. I was 14 years old. I was in the Boy Scouts. And we would always ask our mothers and fathers if we could come early. We always had the scout meeting in this big church, and it had a big garden and big front concrete steps. And so we'd arrive early, the parents would drop us off, and we'd play hide and seek for a good half an hour before the scoutmasters would come. And I remember on this one night, I was hiding, somewhere on the lawn, and I could see the seekers walk off, and I thought, okay, I'm going to make my way for a home base, which was the front steps. And as I was running full pelt, nobody was coming after me, but I was like, nobody's going to get me no matter what. Full pelt towards the steps, and I missed the step. I literally missed it and caught my foot. And it was one of those moments where you're going so fast and caught so much off guard that my arms didn't come forward in time. And I went on my head, bounced twice on my head, and I laid there in shock. And I finally sat up, and other people, the other kids started coming up and, to home base, and I didn't tell anybody. I was lying there, obviously concussed as well, and my vision came to like a pinprick, I could only see like a pinprick of the environment, and I sort of stood myself up, and I felt my way into the room where we would meet, and the whole scout meeting, I sat there, at the table with just this little bit of pinprick of light. Didn't tell anybody, didn't tell the scoutmaster. At the end, the vision opened up a little bit more, and my mother came to pick me up, and I got in the car. I didn't tell my mother. I don't know why I didn't tell anybody. And I remember going to sleep that night, thumping head, and I woke up at some time in the morning with beings actually around me. And it felt really physically real, but I must have been out of phase because I could actually, hear them properly, and they were communicating like, we need to take him. And there was a massive surge of energy, and I was actually, it was an out-of-body experience, and I was moved to one of these healing centers on the astral. And a lot of energetic work was being done on me by humans and non-humans. And it was quite a profound experience, and again, very vivid in my mind right now. And then I was brought back to my body. And the next morning, I was absolutely fine. My vision was fine. Everything was okay. But I was sort of left with this impression that I was actually in serious trouble, and that they intervened on that occasion. And it was one of those experiences that just stand out. And again, nothing ever happened after that, but it was like an intervention took place. And I had another couple of close near-death experiences when I was a child. One including falling into a pond, an old sort of fishery pond, which was no longer in use. I think I was 4 years old at the time, and this was before my out-of-body journeys. I was under the water for quite a while, and I actually started to see light underneath the water. And then my second to the oldest brother actually was the one that finally dragged me out of the water. That was my first sort of encounter, if you like, with light, and having an early memory of that nature. Now, something else that I want to share in a few minutes, but I want to prime you for. I remember an experience in physical reality when I was 7. And it was the only time I traveled with my mother on a plane. I had 3 brothers and my father, and we traveled alone, my mother and myself. And we went to visit some relatives in Indiana, which is quite a flight from Florida, probably a good 6-hour flight. And I remember everything so well. I remember speaking to my mother and saying, what if the wings fall off? Or, we were joking around, and I was excited. And again, very vivid memory of all of this. And then my mother came over a couple of years ago, and Sky and I had just got together, and Sky met my mother for the first time. And I remember telling my mother, I don't know why I was sharing this, but I said, do you remember when I was 7 years old and we went on that flight to Indiana? And she was very confused. And she said, Todd, you were 2 months old. And I said, but we were talking and we were sharing stuff. And she said, Todd, you were 2 months old. Oh, my God. And, so just keep that in mind as we take this conversation a little bit deeper, because I want you to be aware that some children, not all children, will have very early memories of being able to communicate with their parents, still having memories of where they just come from recently. The closer, and down to the energy and life experiences, people can stay really connected to where they just came from after being birthed in this level of reality. And they can have a good level of awareness. Some babies are there going, wah, wah, wah. They're like, pay attention. I'm trying to talk to you. Stop going gag, gag, goo, goo. But yeah, that was a really interesting experience that my mother was just, like I said, just completely confused. And it confused me. And but these things are there for you to sort of delve into. Think about some of your earliest memories. Maybe seeing things that other people would say that wasn't there, or our invisible friends that people clearly say, oh no, that wasn't real. My youngest daughter, when she was going to, I think it was first year, and so yes, it must have been, because she was around 6 years old. And I remember going to pick her up from school, and we were walking, and she said, Daddy, she goes, do you know God? And I was like, not personally. And I said, why? And she said, she started saying a few things, and I was like, are you learning this in religious studies? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, oh, okay. And then she paused, and then she was like, but I've got some memories of my own. And I was like, okay, what do you got going on? And she said, she kind of like broke off and didn't say anything for a few minutes. And then she came back with something, just went off somewhere else. And she's like, there's a little girl that comes to the playground when I'm at school, and nobody else can see her. She said her name's Amy, and she had her last name as well. And she said Amy knows that she's dead, and that her mommy and daddy moved away after she died, and she doesn't know how to find them. And I was like, holy crap. I wasn't one to ignore something like that because of my experiences at the time. And so I said to my daughter, who was like my older son, a great clairvoyant, and so I said, tell me more about Amy. And she had all this information, and she said, yes, she would come to me only on the playground, no other place. And I was like, well, why would it just be on the playground? And I said, okay, well, look, next time I come to pick you up from the school run, whenever Amy is around, then why don't you let me know? I may not see her, but I can talk and Amy will hear me, and you can give me whatever reply Amy gives, and you can tell me. We never got the opportunity to do that, but I was so wanting that to happen. I was so, ready for something like that for my daughter to sort of learn so much more about this. But I did talk to her and say, look, it's possible that this might have been a real person. And, and I told her about some of my experiences, and they all knew that they'd come down in the morning before school and sometimes find me lying on the sofa or on the chair, and they'd ask me, and I'd tell them what I was doing, and this is why at that age I trained my son. I wanted to be open with them. I didn't push anything on them, but I wanted to be really open with them. I wanted them to be able to come to me if they had any experiences that were really relevant, just like when I was a child. If it meant, now keeping their journal, I'd love to go full circle like that and do this. About 5 years ago, I was about a year into teaching this stuff, and a woman came to the tower. Her name's Rhiannon, and she's an amazing channeler. She came to the tower, and I remember it was the last day. She hadn't had an experience, hadn't had an OBE. It was the last day. It was the last session, and it was the last 5 minutes of the session. She had had an OBE. And I thought it was so beautiful because, again, you get a percentage of people who start to give up at some point within the period, thinking it's not going to happen for me. And she kept her head up above the water. And she kept her emotions in check, and she was persistent. And literally she said, Todd, I just had an OBE. I could hear your voice. I knew it was coming, the end of the session, when suddenly I felt this strong surge of energy. I was above my body, a German girl, and she said, my first instinct was to go home to my mother's house in Germany. And she said, I'd just been to my mother's house, and I'd just come back. And she said it was so physically real. The flying, my mother's house, it was like I remember it. And this was the last 5 minutes of the last session on the last day. And she went home, and within weeks, she had several more out-of-body experiences. And it was about a month or so after her coming to the tower and her having a few more experiences where I was out of my body. And I was in this sort of swamp land. Lots of marsh, lots of critters around. There were some astral citizens. I remember being on this sort of little marshy bit in the middle of this sort of swamp. And on the other side was this bank, which was maybe from me to lands. And there were sort of like reptiles moving about, like some alligators or something of that nature. But all the astral citizens who were there on the other side, who were listening to me talk about stuff and talk about Earth, and I was sharing some things, and they were very fascinated. And suddenly, Rhiannon sort of pops into the experience. She sort of just walks up, and she's standing on the bank of this marsh. And I was like, oh my God, it's Rhiannon. I said, Rhiannon, come over to me. And she was looking down, and you could tell she was looking at the alligators, and she wasn't having any of that. And I was like, Rhiannon, just fly up in the air. This is just like a dream. I could tell she wasn't fully with it yet. And she was still like, no. And then her energy just faded, and she was gone. And I thought, oh, she's back in her body now. And that morning, she sent me a text when I was in one of the shops, I think it was Tesco, and got a text saying, can we talk? And I was like, yeah, of course. And I hadn't relayed the experience to her yet. And she rang me up, and she said, I saw you today. And I don't know if it was a dream or out of body. I just didn't have enough awareness, but I just wanted to check it with you. And I said, okay, go ahead. And she said, well, it was kind of like a swamp, and there was like some crocodiles, and you were standing in the middle of it all. And I remember you inviting me to walk through, but I was so scared of these reptiles that I finally, my fear, and I was gone, and I woke back in my body. And I said to her, that's exactly my memory of the experience. And she was blown away. Within less than a month, we were out of body together, and we were both fully conscious. She was fully lucid within the experience, and we were on a counterpart level of Scotland. And we were riding motorcycles on this counterpart level. We both woke up, and our text messages practically crossed, with very similar content. And it seemed like we had this very strong bond. We had done some horseback riding on another level of reality together, and a real funny experience that I didn't have any memory of, but I get a lot of people when I do these workshops they'll send me messages saying, I had an experience with you last night. Well, I had an experience where I got out of body, and it made me laugh the other night when you reported one of your OBEs or dreams from home during when we were doing the dream journaling in the group. And people they'd get out of body or they'd get loose in a dream, and they'd say things like, take me to Todd. And you had something like that just last week.
It was just that.
It was just that. So anyhow, Jimmy did it just last week, I think. And so I have a lot of these people doing this. And so anyhow, Rhiannon was, she reported into me on one morning. She said, yes, I was out of my body, and I was wandering around, and suddenly I saw you in the distance. And she was like, Todd, and she started waving. And she said, you looked a bit alarmed, and you suddenly manifested like a rug, and you laid down, and you covered yourself over with the rug. And I went over, and I said, Todd, what are you doing? Said, they won't leave me alone. we all have these parts of us. Like when Jürgen went to his grandfather and father on the front garden of this Russian village, and he was communicating with a higher aspect. I mean, you can communicate with people's higher aspects. You can find their higher aspects, in and around places. And Rhiannon she said, I just couldn't stop laughing, Todd. You were just like so upset that people wouldn't leave you alone, and you just literally, you saw me and you thought you would just cover yourself. But I calmed him down, and he felt much better. That's very kind, Rhiannon. Rhiannon's story on how she found me was really quite interesting. The night before she found me, she had a very powerful dreamlike experience where she was told that she needed to come out of her body because they had important things they needed to share with her, but she needed to be stable when she came out. And she was instructed in the dream that she would be directed to someone. And so the next day, she lives down in Devon at the time, and she happened to be going into London, taking the train into London the next day on some work. And in the evening time, when she was wandering around London before she had another appointment, it was around 7 o'clock at night, and she said she saw a bunch of people standing on a street corner, and she went over because they were rolling dice and doing stuff, and she was talking about one of the synchronicity walks. And she walked up, and we had signs on us that said, we're taking a synchronicity walk, come with us or join us. And she said she thought it was just very curious to see about 20 adults being so playful in London. So she came over, and she was listening to some of the stuff I was talking about, and she asked for my card. And so I gave her my card, and she said she just tucked it in her bag and didn't even look at it. She just thought, I'll check this out another time. She said she went home that night, and she took the card out, and she went to my website, and she saw that it was out-of-body teachings and training. And she was like, oh my God, how amazing is this? I had this powerful experience the night before that told I need to be shown, I need to have these experiences, and they need to be able to be stabilized so that they could, do what needs to be done. And here she'd found a teacher like this. And you imagine the coordination that takes place from these other level of realities for these synchronicities to unfold. She could have been misdirected at any point. She could have been guided, she could have used her own free will and ignored guidance. I'm in a rush. I can't go and see these people in the corner over there. But she followed her guidance. And it brought her, it brought us together. And it was really quite powerful because a couple years after we became friends and she got better and better and better, filled, entire journals with amazing information. And she came over I invited her to Ireland to be one of our channelers for the 9 days for, I think it was the second or third trip to Ireland. And I remember one night we both sat at the front in our chairs in front of the group, and I said to her previously, before coming out, I said, why don't you share one of your best stories, then I'll share one of mine, and then you share, and we'll just sort of play back and forth. And she says, yes, and maybe we can leave them sort of with cliffhangers now and again, and then you can start again, and then you leave them with a cliffhanger, then I'll start. And it just felt like she had a plan already. And so Rhiannon started telling her story, and she was telling about how we met, and that first experience that she had. And then she said, she started going deeper with this, and I'll cut out all my stuff and just stay with her line of her story. And she said eventually she started getting out of body regularly and had one individual come to her and said, look, we need to take you to a place for healing. And they were referring to these healing environments on the astral, and they brought her to one of these places. And they said, you will need to go to a doctor on your world, and you'll need to get, sort of an exam. And then you'll return here afterwards. And so she came back to her body, she set up an appointment, and I think it was within a couple of weeks. She did some blood tests and some other things, and then when she got the news, she was at stage 4 cancer. And she had been, sort of all of this was coming about through the out-of-body state that she was being instructed. So she now knew exactly why this seemed so critical. Her guides were like me when I was 14 years old, was now making an intervention. And so she said the experiences would continue, and she went back out of body, and she met with these individuals, and they started giving her healing, in one of these centers on the astral planes. Her energy body, her astral body was receiving healing because it's intimately connected with her physical body. And she was given instructions for a particular diet. And she was also instructed not to undergo the earth therapy that they would have prescribed. And so she told her doctors she doesn't want any of the regular therapies, such as chemotherapy. She was instructed not to tell anybody, not her family, not her friends, not to tell anybody, because their energy of worry could get in the way of the process of healing. And so she had a son. She didn't tell the son. She didn't tell me. I was really good friends with her at the time. She didn't tell her mother, didn't tell any of her friends. And she went through this on her own for a period of, I think, 4 months or more, might have been longer, where she'd go out of the body, she'd do the healing work, she'd come back in her body, and there was a certain diet that she maintained. I think it was 4 months, 6 months, whatever the time period was. And when she went back to the doctor, she was given the all clear. It was gone. It was just eradicated. And the doctors were like, what's happened here? She was at stage 4 cancer, and it was gone. And this is it's got such power to it when you really think about this. I mean, they're aware of us. We're not alone here at any point on this level of reality. We have to trust. When we hear so many stories, when you have your own stories and you start putting the puzzle pieces together, reality is profoundly interesting. And you do have beings who, deeply love you. It is for us to learn to get past this barrier of fear that stops us from being able to reach out and make these connections through lucid dreams, make these connections, through out-of-body experiences, make these connections through remote viewing, through waking reality here, just by tuning in and trusting that we can, even if it just feels like imagination at first, remove the just and realize that imagination is a powerful tool of consciousness. Reoccurring dreams. Who's had reoccurring dreams?
What?
Reoccurring dreams. Put your hand up, I didn't get to see. So quite a few of you. Who's had the same dream more than 5 times? Who's had the same dream more than 10 times? 20? 30? 40? I'm aware of Lance's experiences. Lance is going through some serious stuff at the moment, so I don't know if he shared it with anyone, but he's going through some serious stuff, which is every night now. And it's very physical in nature. Anyhow, I won't go into it. It's very personal for Lance. You can actually have reoccurring OBEs. And this was, I don't even think, a year into my out-of-body journeys. And I went back to the same environment 3 times. And I'd learned the first time on arrival, because I had a guide with me that said this is what is a astral simulation environment. And these environments are designed for people who are incarnated back onto planet Earth into environments that will be very similar to the environment that they'll be in when they're born and where they'll grow up. And simulation using the skills that they're going to take with them. And they're practicing these skills before coming into their body. Imagine people like Beethoven. 4 years old, was it, when he was out playing his teachers? Was that right, 4 years old? Mozart. Yes, Mozart, it was, yes. Imagine Mozart in one of these environments. His skill, he knew one of his skills he would be going into that lifetime with was playing the piano. he chose that with great conscious awareness, all the practice, and then coming into that lifetime and child protege. I always wondered, was it just from past lives that we have these skills that we bring forward? It isn't just from past lives. Sometimes we choose, the skill before going into that life, and we're actually practicing that skill in these very earth-like simulations before we go into the actual body. It is reported, not just what I'm going to report now, but also from other out-of-body explorers, that these individuals can actually their consciousness can be melded to the growing form within the woman's womb, and they will still retain their adult astral nature during the womb, and they will come and go from the womb, getting familiar with the energy of the mother, getting familiar with the new body, starting to gather more energy into that body, and still being aware of their astral self, still practicing in those astral simulation zones. On my first experience there, I was introduced by my guide to a woman whose name was Deborah. And when Deborah went out, she went out on this rowing boat out onto this lake. And I was with her, and my guide instructed me that she will probably change in age as I'm on the boat with her because she's going through the simulation. And I just sat on the boat and talking with her, and I felt a connection with her. It was really quite strong. And she was telling me about, as we were rowing out into the lake, and as she was still her adult self, she was like telling me about, the life that she knew the closest to this one. And she said that she was married during that lifetime, and that her and her husband had got in with some bad people, and they were murdered by these people. And I was like, oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. She's alive in front of me. It's not really, you don't really have to be sorry, but it's almost like instinct. And suddenly she felt that it was time, and she started shifting her appearance for the simulation, and she was now a 6-year-old girl sat before me. She had this beautiful sort of light brown hair, crystal blue eyes. And again, I felt such a deep connection with her. And I remember returning to my body, and I wrote all this down in my journal. And within the next few months, I visited Deborah a few more times. And then on the fourth time I went back, and she was gone. And I kind of called out, where's Deborah? And suddenly one of my sort of helpers appeared and said, she's now birthed, into physical reality. And I was like, oh, that's wonderful. And I was a bit sad because I had a really nice bond with her. And my guide was like, would you like to see her in her new life? And I was like, that would be amazing. That would be fascinating because I'd never had an experience like that. And we came back towards the earth plane, and we came into this house, and we were in this bedroom, and there was a crib, and the child was in the crib. And I was now communicating with the higher consciousness of the child, and Deborah was like, oh, it's good to see you again. And then suddenly somebody walked into the room, and it was my 5-year-old son. And this was my daughter. Yeah, whoa. And I mean, it was so beautiful. I was just like, holy fuck. I was there in these astral simulations with this woman. And then it wasn't too long after that when she was, I think, age 5, and the birth mark on her forehead was very apparent, and it was also on my son. And that's when I decided to check into their history. And the lifetime that she was telling me about on the boat, where her and her husband got into, with some bad people, and eventually these people murdered them. That was that Bonnie and Clyde style life I was talking about a few nights ago, where they were both sort of shot execution style for wanting to leave this gang. And I was absolutely stunned and bowled over with all of this. The little girl that I saw on the boat was the girl that she grew into. Her crystal blue eyes everything. Age 6, she started having those clairvoyant experiences. One of the things she was practicing out on the water was clairvoyance. She was practicing that as a skill to remember who she was in this lifetime, to remember about, where she came from, so she could tune in and assist people. And I got to meet her as an adult on the astral before she came into this level of reality. That's my favorite experience. That's my number one experience of all time, and I've never told anybody. I've never told my daughter, never told my son, haven't told Sky. I had a Russian pilot come to one of my tower experiences years ago, and he was a very open-hearted individual. I remember the first day he was there, we used to do a chakra meditation on the first day. We'd use this amazing track, and everybody would chant all the different sounds for the different chakras. And about halfway through, I opened my eyes, and I looked around the room to see how people were getting on, and he was just blubbering away on the sofa, just profusely crying. And I went to him afterwards, and I said, are you okay? Are you feeling okay? And he said, I do a heart-centered meditation every day. And he said, this is pretty normal for me. I just get really, the unconditional love just pours through. And you could feel him radiate this energy. I mean, he was a very, very special man. He didn't have an OBE at the 2-day event. I think it might have been about a month when he finally reported back that he'd had his first experience. And he said, he actually wrote me an email. So he's Russian. His English wasn't so good. The email was all over the place. And I was like trying to read this. I was like, oh my God, this is difficult going stuff. But he was reporting how he was lying down practicing when suddenly this white light just flooded all around him. And he could see through his eye mask, all this white light. And he said there was this sea of hands. And I was like, wow, I had one hand. He's got all these hands, And he said there were like hands of all sort of orientation. He said there were like from all different kind of species, he thought. He said there was like human hands, and there were like, E.T. hands, and he said there were other hands. Sorry. That happens. Okay. And he said, I finally put out my hand, and one of the hands reached for me and pulled me into the light. And he said this other hand then sort of let go of me, and I was just flying through this light and this energy. And he said I was in this very high dimension. And from what he was explaining in his email, I reckon he was, in one of these higher planes of consciousness, maybe the border between the high astral and the higher planes of consciousness. But yeah, I think it was probably deeper. And he said the waves of energy that were emanating in this place. He said, I meditate and I feel this love all the time, but he said, I never felt anything like it. He said, I've got 2 children, Todd. He's writing all this. He said, I've never felt, even the love I have for my children, it paled in comparison to the waves of energy that I was feeling in this place. And he's writing, he said, but then it was even more. He said, I suddenly came to this place. It was like a gate. He was describing a portal because our minds will usually overlay energies like this with the idea of like a gate or something. And he said, I could see into this next environment. And the energy that was spilling over into this, this other place, he said was maybe 100 times more powerful than what I was experiencing, which was, 100 times more powerful than anything I'd felt previously. And he said it was just spilling over. And he said he walked up to the gate, and he was just about to cross over, and he thought, if I step into this place, I will not go back to my body. He just suddenly felt like the life he knew was it was nothing anymore. And he said in that moment, that when he had that thought, suddenly these 2 light beams swept, from this environment towards the gate. And they said, this is not your time to come to this place. And he said he was just like, I can't go back. I can't go back. I know this place. I can't go back. And he could just feel like he was being drawn home. And he said, but within a very short period of time that they'd shown him, got information from his personal Akashic record, his life sort of path, his life plan. And he said it was in his head and he could see that he still had things to do. And he was high-level information showing that he has a retreat center that he still has to put together while he's still here. And he said, they didn't force me to come back, but their love and their reassurance and, that they would be with me, I came back on my own. And he finished off writing, he goes, I'm really sorry about, the writing is really bad. He said, I can't stop crying. And he says, I've been crying ever since I came back into my body. This was his very first experience. His very first out-of-body experience. 1 month after he left the tower. He was consistent, he practiced, and he didn't give up. And he had this really powerful experience. I think it was within the first 3 months after that, he filled 4 journals of 200 pages each. 4 journals. And not one of them was earth, bound type experiences. They were all higher plane sort of experiences. And I've encouraged him to write a book. He's had some really amazing experiences. I'd like him to come to give a talk at some point. He's a very humble person. I mean, you could feel the energy of Jürgen, very humble man. Same kind of caliber. He's just so humble. He just feels, everybody's got their own sort of path, and he doesn't want to get in anybody's way. And I was like, well, this is inspirational stuff, But yeah, this is what I wanted to share with you tonight. I understand, you had a nice experience with Jade.